Welcome to All Things Storybound, a creative outlet where any and all kinds of stories come to life.
From magical to mythical to mortifying, let us take you on a journey you've never experienced before.
Grab your favorite drink and get comfortable. You're in for a wild story ahead. Chapter 1.
The city had changed, but not enough for Hope to forget. The skyline was taller, the streets busier, but certain corners of the city were frozen in time, just like her memories. She found herself walking past her old high school more often than she cared to admit, always avoiding the gaze of the empty windows, as if the ghosts of her past still lingered there. 10 years was a long time, but not long enough to forget someone like Xander. She hadn't planned on spending her 20s haunted by a mystery. No one had an answer for where he went or why. It was as if Xander had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but whispered rumors and a hollow ache in her chest. At first, the police had been involved. Search parties, missing posters, even a tearful news broadcast. But weeks turned into months and then years. People moved on. Hope tried to do the same, except she couldn't. The phantom of his disappearance still clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of him in a crowded street or in the corner of her vision. An illusion, always, but one that still made her heart leap before it sank. She hated that part of herself, the part that still held on to a hope that he would return. And then he did. It was a Friday night like any other when she received the text. Hope was curled up on her couch, half watching some mindless TV show she wasn't paying attention to when her phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number. "It's me. Meet me at Hannah's Cafe tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no name, but there didn't need to be. She knew. She knew. Hope stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her ears. Could it be a cruel joke? She hadn't spoken about Xander to anyone in years, not even to her closest friends. They had long given up on that chapter of her life, assuming she'd moved on. She wasn't sure if she had or not, but she never brought it up. It was easier that way. Her fingers hovered over the screen as doubt crept in. Should she reply? Should she go? After everything, could she even face him again? But the pull was too strong. Curiosity, longing, maybe even anger. All of it boiled inside her until she found herself typing back a simple response. Why now? No reply. Hours passed, and still nothing. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but by morning, her mind was made up. She had to know. Hannah's Cafe hadn't changed. A tiny, hole-in-the-wall spot nestled between a thrift store and a closed-down pharmacy. It had been their favorite hangout back in high school. Walking in felt like stepping back into the past, and for a moment, Hope was 17 again, waiting for Xander with a cup of overpriced coffee. She shook off the eerie nostalgia and found a booth near the back, just out of sight of the front windows. Minutes ticked by slowly, her nerves building with each passing second. She fidgeted with her phone, checking the time, wondering if this was all a cruel joke. Just when she was about to leave, the door creaked open, and she saw him. Xander. He looked the same, yet different. His hair was a little longer, his face a little sharper, but there was something else, something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before, a wariness, like he was expecting the world to collapse around him at any moment. Hope's heart hammered in her chest as he walked over to her booth, his movements slow and deliberate. He slid into the seat across from her without saying a word. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of 10 years of silence hanging between them like a wall. "It's really you," Hope finally breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. Xander nodded, but there was no warmth in his expression.
I'm sorry,
he said quietly, his voice hoarse and raw, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. "Where the hell have you been?" The question came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't care. She deserved answers. After all this time, after everything she had been through. Do you have any idea what you put me through? What you put all of us through?
I know.
He replied, his eyes flicking to the door and back again.
I didn't have a choice.
Hope clenched her fists under the table. What do you mean, didn't have a choice? You disappeared, Xander. You vanished without a word, without a trace. I thought you were dead. We all did.
I couldn't tell you.
He said, his voice dropping to a whisper.
I still can't. It's not safe.
Hope's eyes narrowed. Not safe. Safe from what? Xander hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously against the table.
You have to trust me on this, Hope. I came back because I need to keep you safe. Things have been happening, and I don't have much time.
Her frustration flared. Keep me safe? From what? You're not making any sense. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a split second, she saw it. Fear. Raw, bone-deep fear that sent a chill down her spine.
I'm being hunted,
He whispered.
and now they're after you too.
Hope froze, her pulse quickening. She wanted to laugh it off, to tell him he was crazy. But something about the way he said it, something about the darkness in his eyes, made her swallow her words. Before she could respond, Xander stood up abruptly.
I shouldn't have come.
He muttered.
It's too dangerous.
Xander, wait.
I'll find you when it's safe.
He cut her off, turning to leave.
Stay inside. Don't trust anyone.
And just like that, he was gone, slipping out the door and disappearing into the night as quickly as he had come. Hope sat there, her heart racing, her mind spinning. The cafe felt suddenly colder, the shadows longer. Hunted? After me, too? She didn't want to believe him, but deep down, she felt it. Something was wrong. Something was coming.
Chapter 2.
Hope couldn't sleep. She tried, burying herself under layers of blankets, as if hiding could protect her from the thoughts circling her mind. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Xander's face, pale, hollow, filled with a fear that wouldn't leave her alone. Hunted. The word rang in her mind like an alarm she couldn't shut off. What had he meant? Who was after him, and why did he think she was in danger too? More importantly, why had he come back now after all these years? And why did he look like he hadn't aged a day? It made no sense. Frustration gnawed at her. She wanted to be angry at him. She was angry at him, but beneath the anger was something much more dangerous. Curiosity. No matter how bizarre his words had been, no matter how unsettling his behavior, she couldn't shake the feeling that Xander's return was the beginning of something terrible. And that feeling was creeping up her spine, into the corners of her apartment, turning the familiar into something sinister. Around 3 a.m., she gave up on sleep altogether. Restless, she paced around her living room, her eyes darting to the windows as if expecting to see someone, or something, watching from the street below. The city outside was quiet, but Hope couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. She pulled her phone from her pocket, staring at the blank screen, willing Xander to message her again. She didn't want to contact him first. Pride, maybe, or fear of what he might say. But the silence was worse. She needed answers. It wasn't until the next morning that she got a response. Hope sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cold cup of coffee, when her phone buzzed. The same unknown number. Her stomach twisted as she opened the message. Meet me tonight, usual spot, 9 p.m. I'll explain everything. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed back, "You better." All day, the message played on a loop in her mind, fueling her anticipation. What did Xander mean by explain everything? Would he actually tell her the truth this time? Or was he just going to feed her more cryptic half-truths that left her with more questions than answers? The hours crawled by slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. By the time 9 p.m. arrived, she was already waiting at the cafe, a knot of tension winding tighter and tighter in her chest. She had chosen a table near the back, her eyes glued to the door. When Xander finally walked in, the air seemed to shift. It wasn't just her imagination. The barista, the other customers, they all seemed to quiet down as if sensing something off about him. Maybe it was his posture, the way his eyes swept the room with a hunted look, or the slight hunch in his shoulders as though he was preparing to flee at a moment's notice. He slid into the booth opposite her, his movements stiff and mechanical. Hope could tell immediately that something had changed. His face was paler, his eyes sunken deeper into their sockets. "Xander?" she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's going on? You need to stop running around like this. If you're in danger, we can figure it out, but I need to know the truth." Xander's eyes darted around the room as if checking for someone or something. He leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper.
I don't have much time. You shouldn't be here.
Hope's frustration bubbled up. You keep saying that, but you're not telling me anything. How am I supposed to help you if you won't tell me what's happening? He stared at her for a long moment, something flickering in his eyes, something fragile.
I don't know how to explain it. I've been running for years. I've been hiding. They've been following me.
Who? Hope pressed. Xander shook his head.
Not who, what?
His voice trembled, his fingers tapping the table in a nervous rhythm.
They're not people, Hope. They're something else. I don't even know what to call them anymore.
Hope's heart raced. You're not making sense,
I know.
he whispered, his eyes growing wild, desperate.
I know it sounds insane, but they're after me, and now they're after you. You have to believe me, Hope. They've been watching us ever since.
He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening. Ever since what? She demanded, her patience fraying, but Xander's gaze shifted again, darting towards the door.
I can't talk here. It's not safe.
He stood up, his movements jittery, as if his body couldn't keep still. Xander!
I'll find you later.
He cut her off, his body shaky.
Go home, lock your doors, stay inside tonight.
He rushed out of the cafe before she could stop him, leaving her sitting there, stunned and confused. Her hands trembled as she picked up her coffee, now cold and forgotten. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. She couldn't explain it, but the air felt heavier, her senses sharper. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, though no one was looking in her direction. On her walk home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She glanced over her shoulder several times, her pulse quickening. But the streets were empty. Still, her nerves wouldn't settle. The familiar buildings of the city seemed to loom over her more than usual, their shadows longer, stretching towards her like grasping fingers. By the time she reached her apartment, her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath shallow. She quickly locked the door behind her, her fingers trembling as she slid the deadbolt into place. She leaned her back against the door, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She was safe. She was inside. Nothing was out there. Nothing but her overactive imagination. But then, just as her breathing started to slow, there was a noise. A soft, scraping sound coming from the hallway. Hope's blood ran cold. She held her breath, listening. The noise came again, closer this time. Her body tensed, every instinct screaming at her to hide, but she forced herself to stay still, her mind racing through a dozen explanations. Maybe it was just her neighbor, or the old building settling, but deep down, she knew it wasn't simple. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The hallway outside her door felt deathly silent, the kind of silence that made her skin crawl. Hope's breath hitched as she took a cautious step back from the door. The shadows in her apartment seemed darker than before, pooling in the corners like liquid black. Her heart swam with thoughts of Xander, of what he had said, of the thing he was running from. Before she could stop herself, she reached for the peephole and looked through it. The hallway was empty, but just as she was about to step away, she saw it. Movement. A shadow, dark and shapeless, slithering across the floor at the far end of the hallway. Hope stumbled back, her heart thudding in her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow stopped just in front of her door, and then nothing. The silence stretched on, suffocating her, but she didn't dare make a sound. Whatever it was waiting.
Chapter 3.
Hope didn't sleep that night. She stayed curled up on her couch, every light in her apartment on, as if the brightness alone could keep the shadows at bay. Her eyes stayed fixed on the door, her mind replaying the image of that creeping shadow in the hallway. Hours passed, and still the feeling of being watched lingered. It was more than just fear. It was a gnawing certainty that something was out there waiting for her. Xander's words echoed in her mind, his cryptic warnings now making more sense than she wanted to admit. Not people, something else. By dawn, Hope was exhausted, her body heavy with sleeplessness, but the daylight brought no relief. As the sun rose, casting the city in its usual golden glow, she still couldn't shake the sense that her world had tilted, that reality was slipping out of her grasp. Nothing felt real anymore, not even her own memories. After a long, hot shower, one that did little to wash away the creeping unease, Hope called her best friend, Sophia. She hadn't told anyone about Xander's return yet, but the events of last night had her spiraling. She needed to talk to someone who hadn't been pulled into this nightmare. Sophia answered on the third ring. "Hey, stranger," she said in that upbeat tone she always had. "You okay? You sound weird." Hope hesitated, pacing back and forth in her tiny living room. I don't even know how to explain it, Soph. Something's happened. I need to talk to you." "Okay, sure. Want to grab coffee later? I'm free around noon." "Yeah, that works." She paused, then added, "But it's about Xander." Sophia went silent on the other end of the line. "Wait, Xander? The Xander who ghosted all of us 10 years ago? That Xander?" Hope bit her lip. "Yeah, he's back." A beat of stunned silence. "What the hell? You've got to be kidding. What does he want? Where has he been?" "I don't know. He won't tell me anything. He just keeps saying he's being hunted. Something's after him, and now it's after me too." Even as she said it, Hope could hear how ridiculous it sounded. How insane. Sophia let out a soft laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Hope, you know that sounds crazy, right?" "I know it does, but last night, I swear, Soph, something was outside my door. It wasn't human. I saw it." Another pause. "Okay, look, let's meet up. I don't know what's going on, but I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Maybe Xander's just messing with your head. You remember how he was, always into weird stuff. Maybe he's pulling some kind of twisted prank." Hope sighed, rubbing her temples. "Maybe, I don't know, I can't shake this feeling like I'm losing it. Everything feels wrong." "I get it. Just hang tight, okay? We'll talk it out in person." Noon couldn't come fast enough. Hope spent the morning distracted, jumping at every sound, every slight movement in the corner of her eye. The sensation of being watched persisted, like a heavy weight pressing down on her. When she finally met up with Sophia at a nearby cafe, she felt slightly more grounded, the bustle of the city keeping her from slipping too far into her own thoughts. Sophia greeted her with a concerned frown, already seated at a table near the window. "Hey," Sophia said, giving her a quick hug before sitting down. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't," Hope admitted, slumping into her seat. "It's been a rough night." Sophia leaned in, her brow furrowed. "So tell me everything. What did Xander say? Where's he been?" Hope recounted the entire story. How Xander had disappeared without a trace, and how he'd resurfaced out of nowhere, and the strange warnings he'd given her. She didn't hold back about the shadow outside her door, or the gnawing fear that something was wrong with reality itself. Sophia listened quietly, her expression growing more serious by the minute. When Hope finished, she leaned back, arms crossed. "That's a lot," she said carefully. "But Hope, you have to consider the possibility that this is all in your head. I'm not saying you're crazy, but trauma does weird things to people. It's been 10 years. Maybe Xander's return is just messing with you more than you realize." Hope shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I thought the same thing, but it's not just me. He's scared too, Sophia. He wouldn't just show up out of nowhere for no reason." "Maybe," Sophia replied, clearly unconvinced. "But Hope, shadows? Being hunted by something that isn't human? You have to admit, it sounds a little crazy." "Yeah, I know." Hope rubbed her hands over her face. "But I can't shake it. I can feel it, Soph. There's something wrong. Every time I'm around him, it's like reality is slipping." Sophia sighed. "Okay, then why don't we confront him together? Maybe if we both talk to him, we can figure this out. I'm sure there's some explanation for all this." Hope hesitated. She didn't want to drag Sophia into this, into the growing madness that was creeping into her life. But she also didn't want to face Xander alone again, not after what had happened last night. "Yeah," Hope agreed slowly. "Maybe that's a good idea." They agreed to meet Xander at a park near the edge of the city, an old spot where the three of them used to hang out in high school. As they walked toward the park, Hope's nerves started to fray again. The shadows in the alleys seemed to stretch longer than they should, like fingers reaching out for her. Sophia, however, seemed calm, though her casual demeanor faltered when they arrived at the park. The air was strangely still, the usual chatter of kids playing and birds chirping replaced by an eerie silence. They sat on a bench near the old rusted swings, waiting. Minutes passed. Then more. Xander was late. Sophia tapped her foot impatiently. "Where is he?" Hope's stomach churned with anxiety. What if something happened to him? What if something followed him? And then, in the distance, she saw him. Xander was walking toward them, his pace hurried, his eyes darting around like a hunted animal. He looked worse than before, pale, gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones. He looks terrible, Sophia muttered, standing up. What the hell is going on with him? As Xander approached, Hope saw it again. That deep, unsettling fear in his eyes. But this time, there was something else. Something darker. Something that sent a chill through her veins.
I'm sorry.
Xander said as he reached them, his voice shaking.
I shouldn't have come.
What are you talking about? Sophia demanded, stepping forward. We want answers, Xander. You can't just keep running around like this, scaring Hope. What's going on? Xander's gaze flicked to her, but it didn't stay. He was focused on something behind them, something in the distance. His eyes widened, and suddenly he grabbed Hope's arm.
We have to go. Now.
Sophia stepped in front of him. You're not going anywhere until you explain. But Xander wasn't listening. His grip tightened on Hope, his voice a harsh whisper.
They're here.
Hope's heart skipped a beat. Who? Xander didn't answer. He pulled her forward, panic in his movements.
We're out of time.
Sophia's voice faded behind them as Xander dragged Hope deeper into the park, away from the open fields and into the thick cover of trees. Panic clawed at her chest, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She didn't know what they were running from, but the terror in Xander's eyes told her everything she needed to know. It was real. Xander! She shouted, pulling her arm free. What's happening? He stopped, his chest heaving.
They found me. I thought I could keep them away, but I was wrong. They know I'm here.
Who? What are you talking about? Her voice cracked with desperation. Xander's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw the boy she used to know. The boy she had loved. But that boy was gone. Replaced by someone hollow. Someone haunted by things she couldn't understand.
The hunters.
He whispered.
They've always been watching, but now they're watching you too. Chapter 4.
Hope's legs burned as she ran through the trees, the thick branches tearing at her clothes, her breath ragged and uneven. She didn't know where Xander was taking her, but the panic in his eyes, the fear that radiated from him, it was contagious. The sense of being watched clung to her like a second skin. Every rustle of the leaves, every gust of wind felt like a predator's breath on her neck. Behind them, Sophia's voice had disappeared, swallowed by the dense woods. For a brief moment, Hope thought about turning back, but then Xander's grip tightened on her arm, pulling her deeper into the shadows. Where are we going? She gasped, her voice shaking. Xander didn't respond, his eyes darting frantically between the trees. His face was pale, sweat licking his forehead. He looked like a man running from death itself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Xander stopped, his chest heaving. They were in a small clearing, the trees circling them like silent sentinels. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and Hope could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on her. It was as if the forest was holding its breath.
They're close,
Xander whispered, his voice barely audible. He was trembling now, his hands shaking uncontrollably.
I can feel them.
Xander, please, Hope begged, her voice cracking. Tell me what's going on. What are we running from? For a long moment, he didn't answer. He just stared at the ground, his face twisted in fear and something else, guilt. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, broken.
There's something out there, Hope. Something that's been chasing me for years. I don't know what it is. I've never seen it, but I felt it. It's always watching, always waiting. It takes people, changes them. I barely got away.
Hope shook her head, trying to make sense of his words. What do you mean it takes people? What does it want with you?
I don't know.
Xander snapped, his voice rising in desperation.
I don't know what it wants, but it's been after me ever since high school. That's why I left, Hope. I had to. If I didn't, it would have taken me, just like it took.
He stopped, his breath hitching. Took who? Hope pressed, her heart pounding in her chest. Xander's eyes flickered with something dark, something haunted.
All of them.
He whispered.
Everyone it touched, everyone it marked. They're not the same anymore. They're different. I can't explain it, but once it gets its claws into you, it doesn't let go.
Hope felt a cold chill crawl up her spine. And you think it's after me now? Xander nodded, his jaw clenched.
It was always going to come for you. That's why I stayed away for so long. I thought if I kept my distance, I could protect you, but it doesn't matter anymore. It already found you.
Hope's mind raced. Could it be true? Could this thing, this invisible hunter, really be stalking them? She wanted to scream that it was impossible, that Xander was losing his mind. But deep down, in the pit of her stomach, she knew he was telling the truth. She had felt it too. The creeping dread, the sense of being watched, the shadows that didn't belong. But what is it? She asked, her voice shaking. How do we stop it? Xander shook his head, his expression bleak.
You don't. You can't fight it. The only thing you can do is run, hide. And even then, it's only a matter of time.
Hope's blood ran cold. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words never came. Because then she heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable, like the scraping of something sharp against bark. It was coming from the trees, from the darkness beyond the clearing. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Xander froze, his eyes wide with terror.
Oh God.
He whispered, barely audible.
It's here.
Hope's heart pounded in her ears as she scanned the shadows, searching for something, anything, that would explain the noise. But there was nothing, just the trees and the oppressive silence. And then she saw it. At first, it was barely noticeable, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. But as she squinted into the darkness, the figure became clearer, more defined. A shape, tall and slender, its limbs unnaturally long, shifting between the trees like a predator stalking its prey. It was watching them. Hope's breath hitched, her body frozen in place. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. The figure moved closer, slow and deliberate, its eyes, if it had any, locked on her. Xander grabbed her arm, snapping her out of her trance.
Run!
He shouted, yanking her toward the opposite side of the clearing. But Hope's legs felt like lead, her body sluggish as if trapped in a nightmare. The figure followed. She could hear it now, the sound of its limbs dragging through the leaves, its movements inhuman, unnatural. It was closing in on them, its presence pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Hope stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She hit the ground hard, her breath knocked from her lungs. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting to the figure still moving toward them. "Xander!" she screamed. But he was already ahead, barely slowing down. The figure was so close now that she could feel it, an overwhelming sense of wrongness, of something that didn't belong in this world. Its very presence made her skin crawl, her mind scream in protest. And then, just as it was about to reach her, it stopped. Hope gasped, her body trembling, as she watched the figure stand perfectly still, its tall, thin form looming over her. For a moment, it didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching her. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees, its movements so smooth, so unnatural, that it felt like watching a shadow melt into darkness. Hope didn't know how long she stood there, frozen in place. Time seemed to stretch, her mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. When she finally forced herself to move, she stumbled after Xander, her legs weak, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense anymore. Xander was waiting for her at the edge of the woods, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear.
Are you okay?
He asked, his voice trembling. Hope shook her head, unable to speak. She felt like she was still trapped in a nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from.
We have to keep moving.
Xander said, glancing nervously over his shoulder.
It's not gone. It's never gone.
Hours later, they found shelter in an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. The windows were boarded up, the floors creaking beneath their feet. It was a miserable place, but at least it felt safer. For now. Hope sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her mind still reeling. She didn't know how much more of this she could take. The lines between reality and nightmare were blurring, and she wasn't sure how long she could hold on. Xander sat across from her, his face etched with exhaustion. He hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived, and Hope couldn't blame him. She didn't have the energy for words either. But after a long stretch of silence, he finally spoke.
I never wanted this for you.
Hope looked up, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. What do you mean? Xander's gaze was distant, lost in some dark memory.
I thought I could protect you by staying away, but it doesn't matter. It was always going to come for you, for both of us.
Hope's throat tightened. Why? He hesitated, his eyes flickering with guilt.
Because it's been with us for longer than you know. It's been watching you for years, Hope. Ever since high school. Ever since before I left.
Hope's heart pounded in her chest. What are you saying? Xander met her gaze, his expression haunted.
It was never about me. It was always about you. Chapter 5.
Hope's heart stuttered in her chest, Xander's words hanging in the cold, stagnant air between them. It was always about you. She stared at him, trying to process what he had said. It didn't make sense. How could it have always been about her? Xander had disappeared, not her. He had been the one on the run, hunted by whatever dark force was following them. He was the one who had dragged her into this nightmare. What do you mean? Her voice trembled. She didn't want to hear the answer. She didn't want to know what horrifying truth lay beneath Xander's haunted expression. Xander sighed, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of the world had finally crushed him. He leaned back against the crumbling wall of the abandoned building, his eyes hollow.
I didn't understand it at first either. When I left, I thought I was running from it to protect you. But the more I ran, the more I realized it wasn't following me. It was following you.
His voice dropped to a whisper.
It always was.
Hope's blood ran cold. No, that can't be right. Why me? You're the one it's been chasing. You said you've been on the run for years.
I thought I was.
Xander interrupted, his voice raw.
I thought I was protecting you by staying away, but I've come to realize that it was never after me. I was just a means to an end.
He lifted his gaze to meet hers, his eyes filled with a desperate, resigned fear.
It's been watching you, Hope, ever since we were kids.
Hope shook her head, tears pricking at her eyes. That doesn't make any sense. Why would it want me? Xander closed his eyes as if the answer pained him.
I don't know. I don't know what it wants with you. But I do know this. It's been in your life for longer than you realize. The things you felt, the moments when the world didn't seem right, the times you thought you saw something out of the corner of your eye, that was it. It's always been there, waiting.
The room seemed to tilt around her, the walls closing in. Hope pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block out the overwhelming flood of fear and confusion. Memories flashed through her mind, fleeting, distant memories of strange occurrences over the years. The time she woke up in the middle of the night feeling as though someone was watching her. The shadows in her apartment that seemed to move when she wasn't looking. The dreams, the nightmares. Always of something lurking in the darkness just out of sight. Was it real? Had it all been real? No. Her voice cracked. No, you're wrong. You have to be wrong.
I wish I was.
Xander said softly.
But I've seen it. I've felt it. And now you felt it too, haven't you?
Hope froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had felt it. Ever since Xander had returned, the sensation had been growing stronger. The creeping, suffocating sense of being watched. The strange, unexplainable events that followed her wherever she went. She had tried to write it off as paranoia, as trauma resurfacing after Xander's sudden reappearance. But deep down, she knew there was something more. Something wrong. Tears welled in her eyes as the reality of it all came crashing down on her. What does it want from me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Xander shook his head, his expression bleak.
I don't know. I don't think anyone ever knows. But once it has its sights on you, there's no escaping it.
Hope's chest tightened, panic clawing at her insides. Then what do we do? How do we stop it? Xander looked away, his hands trembling.
We can't stop it. All we can do is try to run. But even that won't work forever. It'll always find you in the end.
No, Hope said, shaking her head violently. There has to be a way. There has to be. Xander stood, pacing across the room.
I thought the same thing when it first started. I thought I could outsmart it, find a way to break free. But every time I thought I'd escaped, it found me again. It's like it knows your every move before you make it. like it's in your mind.
Hope's breath hitched. In my mind? Xander stopped pacing, his eyes darkening.
Yeah, it doesn't just hunt you in the real world. It gets into your thoughts, your memories. It changes things. You start to forget what's real and what's not. You start to lose yourself.
Hope felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath her. Was that what had been happening to her? The gaps in her memories, the moments where she couldn't remember what she had done, where she had been, the vivid dreams that felt so real, like she was living in two different worlds? Then how do I know what's real? She asked, her voice trembling. How do I know what's happening right now isn't just another trick? Xander's gaze softened, his voice etched with sorrow.
You don't.
Hope's heart raced, her breath shallow as the walls of the room seemed to press in closer. She was trapped in a nightmare, and no matter how much she tried to wake up, the darkness only deepened. A sudden, sharp sound echoed from the hallway outside, like a scraping, clawing noise, too deliberate to be the wind. Hope's blood ran cold. Xander's eyes widened with panic.
It's here.
Hope's entire body tensed as she stared at the door, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. She could hear it now, the sound growing louder, closer. Her heart thundered in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run. But where? Where could she go? There was no escaping something that could get inside your mind. Xander grabbed her arm, his grip tight.
We have to move. Now.
But Hope couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, her body frozen in place as fear gripped her in its icy claws. She stared at the door, the scraping sound growing louder, more menacing. It was coming for her. The door creaked, the wood groaning as if something heavy was pressing against it. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, making it hard to breathe. Hope's mind swirled with panic, her thoughts racing in every direction. Is this real, or is it just another trick? She turned to Xander, her eyes wild. How do we know this is real? Xander didn't answer. He was staring at the door, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He wasn't sure either. And then the door began to open. Hope's breath hitched, her pulse spiking as the door creaked wider, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement, something tall and slender lurking just out of sight. But before she could make sense of it, the darkness seemed to swallow the doorway whole. Xander's grip tightened on her arm, his voice shaking.
We have to go.
But Hope couldn't move. Her body refused to listen to her. The darkness was pulling her in, tugging at the edges of her mind, twisting reality until she wasn't sure what was real anymore. Was any of this real? Had Xander even come back? Or had all of this been a nightmare from the beginning? The shadows in the doorway shifted again, and this time Hope saw it clearly. An inhuman shape, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head cocked at an odd angle as if it was studying her. It stepped forward, its movements unnervingly smooth, like a shadow come to life. Hope's breath caught in her throat, her body trembling as she stared into the darkness, into the face, or what passed as a face, of the thing that had been hunting them. But as the creature stepped closer, something changed. The air seemed to warp around it, the shadows bending and twisting as the world itself seemed to unravel, and then everything went black. Hope woke up in her apartment, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding her chest. The room was silent, the early morning light filtering through the blinds. Everything was calm, normal, but something was wrong. Her mind felt fractured, pieces of her memory missing. She tried to remember what had happened. Xander, the shadow, the figure in the doorway. But it all felt like a dream, a nightmare. Or was it? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it with trembling hands. A message from an unknown number. It's me. Meet me at Hannah's Cafe, 8 p.m.